At 54, 6 weeks after she signed the divorce papers, on a Tuesday afternoon in a lawyer's office that smelled like burnt coffee and photocopier toner, Lorraine Mackay sat at her kitchen table in Sudbury, Ontario with $340 in her checking account, a box of her ex-husband's things she still hadn't had the nerve to throw out, and a phone call she almost didn't pick up from a number she didn't recognize. The woman on the other end was named Bev Whittle, and she was calling from the township of Chapleau, 4 hours north. She said she was a property clerk, and she was sorry to be the one to say it, but there was a parcel of land registered in Lorraine's name that had been sitting on the municipal tax rolls for 11 years without a single payment, and if someone didn't come up and sort it out within 60 days, the township was going to seize it. Lorraine told her she must have the wrong person. Bev read back the name, Lorraine Ann Mackay, née Dufresne, her maiden name, the name she hadn't used since 1992. Lorraine asked her to read it again. The land Bev said was registered in that name 9 years before her marriage. 4 acres on a logging road off Highway 129, with a structure described only as a cabin, single room, no utilities. Lorraine had never owned land in her life. She had never been to Chapleau. She did not understand how her name could be on a deed for something in a place she had never been, and she did not have a single living relative left who could explain it. But her mother had died 3 months ago. And her mother, Lorraine now understood with a cold, slowly dropping feeling, had kept things to herself the way some women of her generation kept everything. Folded tight, filed away, never mentioned until it was too late to ask why. Before we go further into what Lorraine found up on that logging road, if stories like this one matter to you, please take a second and subscribe to Eprex the Riches, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach now. Let us tell you about Lorraine, and about her mother, and about the thing that had been sitting in the bush north of Chapleau for 9 years waiting for someone to open the door. Lorraine Mackay, she'd kept the married name because changing it at 54 felt like one more thing she didn't have the energy for, had grown up in Sudbury in a 2-bedroom house, on a street that backed onto the nickel tailings, the kind of neighborhood where everybody's father worked the same shift, and everybody's mother knew everybody else's business except their own. Her mother, Greta Dufresne, had worked the counter at a dry goods store for 31 years, raised Lorraine mostly alone after Lorraine's father left when Lorraine was 7, and had spoken about the past the way certain people speak about a sore tooth, carefully around the edges, never directly at it. Lorraine had long ago stopped asking. You learned, growing up with a woman like Greta, that some doors weren't locked so much as they were papered over, and the wallpaper was old enough that pulling at it would bring down more than you bargained for. Her mother had died in February, a stroke. Fast and merciful, the doctor said, as if mercy were something that could be measured in minutes. Lorraine had been in the middle of her own collapse at the time. The marriage had been over in every way that counted for 2 years before the papers made it official, and by the time she sat in that lawyer's office, she had already said goodbye to the house and the joint account and the specific future she had believed she was building. She was 54. She had a rented 2-bedroom apartment in a building with a broken elevator and a property tax bill on a piece of land she had never heard of. In a town 4 hours north, registered in a name she hadn't answered to in 30 years. She drove up on a Thursday morning in April, the kind of Canadian April that can't decide what it wants to be. Snow on the ground in the shadows. Mud everywhere the sun touched, the birch trees bare and white against a sky that sat low and gray over the highway. She had the address Bev Whittle had given her, a lot number and the name of the logging road, and she had a thermos of coffee and her mother's old road atlas because the GPS on her phone lost signal somewhere around Gogama, and she wasn't taking chances. The logging road wasn't on the atlas. She found it by the lot number on a weathered orange stake at the highway shoulder. Easy to miss, the kind of thing you drive past 100 times without looking. The road itself was 2 tire tracks through spruce and poplar, the ground between them grown up with last year's dead grass, and her Civic scraped the high center the whole way in. She was about to decide she'd made a wrong turn when the trees opened up and she was in a clearing above a creek, and there it was. It was a cabin. That was the only word for it, though cabin was doing some work. It was maybe 16 feet square, built from pine logs that had gone dark with age, with a metal roof that had rusted to a deep reddish brown and a stone chimney on the north side. There was a small porch, just a plank deck with a railing, someone had fitted carefully with cedar posts, And on the porch, in a battered wooden chair with a green cushion tied to the seat, was an old man. He was perhaps 75, with a gray beard trimmed close and hands folded in his lap. And he looked at her car with the unhurried patience of someone who had been expecting a visitor, but had no particular opinion about when they arrived. Lorraine sat in the car for a moment. Then she got out. "You must be Greta's girl," the old man said. His name was Douglas Setter, and he had lived in the closest thing to a permanent home he owned, a trailer 10 minutes down the highway, for the past 30 years. He was a retired trapper and bush guide, and he had known Greta Dufresne, he said, for nearly 40 years. Lorraine sat down on the porch step and looked at him. "My mother never mentioned you," she said. Douglas nodded once. "I know," he said. "That was her call to make. I don't hold it against her." He had a key on a piece of paracord around his neck. He'd been checking on the cabin, he said, once a week, same as always. He looked after the roof in the fall, kept the chimney clear, chased the squirrels out of the eaves. He'd been doing it for 9 years, since Greta had the deed put in Lorraine's name and told him. And Douglas said this carefully, like a man who has rehearsed the exact words, that someday the right person would come, and she wanted the place to still be standing when they did. "She put it in my name," Lorraine said. "Without telling me. She was afraid you wouldn't come if she asked," Douglas said, "and she wanted you to come on your own terms, when you needed to." He looked at the creek below. "I expect you needed to." Lorraine did not say anything for a moment. "She's been gone 3 months," she said. "I know," Douglas said. "I'm sorry. She was a particular kind of woman, doesn't come along often." He stood up slowly, the way old men stand up when their joints have opinions about it, and he held out the key. "You should go in," he said. "I'll wait out here. There are some things in there she left for you, and I think you ought to find them yourself. If you're still with us, we need to stop here for a second. Because what Lorraine found inside that cabin is the part of this story we've been working toward from the first sentence. Subscribe if you haven't, and keep watching, because this is where everything changes." Inside, the cabin smelled like pine and something faintly sweet, like dried cedar shavings. And underneath that, faint as old paper, something that stopped Lorraine in the doorway because it was her mother's smell, the particular combination of hand cream and wool that she associated with being 8 years old and sick in bed, and her mother sitting at the edge of the mattress, reading aloud in the half-dark. She stood very still for a moment. The inside of the cabin was one room. There was a wood stove in the corner with a stack of split birch beside it, a cot along one wall neatly made, with a Hudson's Bay blanket in the old point pattern, red and yellow and green, a shelf of books above the cot, mostly paperbacks, spines cracked with reading, a small table with 2 chairs, and on the table, arranged as carefully as a place setting, a tin box and a mason jar holding a bunch of dried wildflowers gone colorless with age, and an envelope with Lorraine's name on it in her mother's handwriting. Not Lorraine Mackay, Lorraine Dufresne. She picked up the envelope and held it. The paper was thick and she could feel there were several pages inside. She set it down and opened the tin box first, because she needed a moment before she could read whatever her mother had written, and the tin would buy her one. Inside the tin were photographs. Not the photographs Lorraine knew. Not the school photos and Christmas snapshots that had lived in the albums on the shelf in her mother's house. These were older. Black and white, or the sepia, a very early color film. A young woman she didn't recognize at first, and then did. Her mother maybe 20, laughing at something outside the frame. Her hair loose around her shoulders in a way Lorraine had never once seen in real life. Beside her in several of the photos was a man, tall, dark-haired, his arm around Greta's shoulders with the easy familiarity of someone who has done that 1,000 times. Lorraine had never seen this man in her life. There was a second person in several of the later photographs, a child. A little girl, 3 or 4, with dark braids, and her chin tipped up in a way that Lorraine recognized, because it was the same way her own daughter held her chin when she was about to argue about something. Lorraine had always thought her daughter got that from her ex-husband's side. She looked at the photographs for a long time. Then she sat down at the table and opened the envelope. Her mother wrote the way she had always spoken, plainly, without decoration, with the particular economy of someone who has thought very carefully about every word, and left out everything that wasn't necessary. The letter was 4 pages in her mother's neat, unhurried cursive. It had been written 2 years before she died. Lorraine could tell by the handwriting that her mother's hand had still been steady when she wrote it. The man in the photographs was named Raymond Carrier. He had been her mother's first, and her mother wrote without any apparent drama, only real love. They had met in 1968 when Greta was 19 and Raymond was 22 and working construction on a dam project in northern Ontario. They had been together for 4 years, and in the winter of 1971, when Greta was 22 years old, she had a daughter, the little girl in the photographs. Lorraine sat very still. The little girl's name was Claire. She had been born in February 1972 in a hospital in Sudbury, and she had been placed for adoption 6 weeks later because Raymond Carrier had gone back to his family in Hearst, a family Greta had not known existed until the 4th month of her pregnancy. And a 22-year-old woman working a dry goods counter in 1972 had very few options that anyone in her life was prepared to help her see. Greta had never told anyone, not her own mother, not a priest, not Lorraine's father when he eventually came along, not Lorraine. She had carried it for 50 years the way you carry something you believe you have no right to set down. The cabin, her mother wrote, had been Raymond Carrier's. He had died in 2003 and left it to Greta in a will that had surprised everyone in his family except, perhaps, those who had been paying attention. Greta had not known what to do with it. She could not sell it. She could not come up and spend time in it without feeling things she had spent decades learning not to feel. But she could not let it go either, because Raymond had built it himself, log by log, in the summers of the early 70s, and because there was a name carved into the lintel above the door. She said to look. That was the only place Raymond Carrier's handwriting still existed in the world. Lorraine got up and looked at the lintel. Claire, 1972, carved into the pine with what must have been a pocket knife, the letters deep and careful, and a little uneven. The way you carve when you want something to last. She sat back down. Her mother had put the deed in Lorraine's name, the letter explained, because she was dying, and she didn't know how to explain any of this in the time she had left. She had hoped. And Lorraine could hear in the word hoped the entire weight of what Greta Dufresne had never said in her life. That the deed would bring Lorraine here, and that the box and the letter would explain what the deed could not, and that Lorraine would understand what she was asking even though she hadn't said it directly. What she was asking, the letter made clear in its last paragraph, was this: Claire had been found. Claire had found her, rather through one of the ancestry registries, 2 years before Greta died. They had exchanged letters. They had met once in Greta's kitchen, a meeting that Greta described in one sentence: "She has your grandfather's eyes," and did not elaborate on because elaborating was not how Greta Dufresne did things. Claire lived in Timmins. She was 51 years old. She had children of her own. And she had asked gently whether there was anyone else, any siblings, anyone who might want to know her. Greta had been too frightened to answer that question while she was alive. She was asking Lorraine to answer it for her. At the bottom of the letter, in handwriting slightly shakier than the rest, like it had been added later, or like the hand that wrote it had not been entirely steady. "I'm sorry I was a coward about this. You deserved to know you had a sister. She deserved to know she had one. I kept the secret because I was ashamed. I understand now that the shame was always mine to carry, not hers and not yours. Do with this what you can. I believe you'll know what's right." Lorraine sat at that table in that cabin for a long time. Outside, she could hear Douglas moving around on the porch, the quiet creak of the old chair. She had driven 4 hours north to sort out a tax bill on land she didn't know she owned. She had found a sister she had not known existed. She had found her mother. Not the version she'd grown up with, careful, spare, papered over Greta, but the one underneath. The 22-year-old woman who had loved someone, and lost him, and lost the child that came from it, and put everything that was left of that whole life into a tin box in a cabin in the bush, and carried the silence of it for 50 years. Lorraine did not cry in the cabin. She cried later, in the car backed into the clearing with the engine running and the heat on, and the gray April sky pressing down on the spruce trees. She cried the way she had not let herself cry since the divorce, not for the marriage, not even for her mother exactly, but for the specific grief of learning that someone you thought you knew had been a stranger to you in ways that changed the shape of everything you thought you understood. She had a sister. She was 54 years old and she had a sister, and she did not know what to do with that except to start. Douglas was still on the porch when she came back. He looked at her face and didn't say anything about it. "Did you know?" she asked. "About Claire? I knew there was a daughter," he said. "Greta told me that much maybe 10 years ago. Not her name or where she was. Just that there was a girl she'd lost and never stopped thinking about. He paused. She talked about you too. She was proud of you. I want you to be sure you know that. She had a strange way of showing it, Lorraine said, and then felt immediately that this was unfair, and also true, and also more complicated than either of those things. Douglas didn't disagree. She was a woman who loved people quietly, he said, sometimes too quietly. It's a particular kind of loneliness, keeping that much to yourself. He looked at the cabin. She wanted you to have this place. I think she thought, if you came here and read the letter, you'd understand her better than you did. Whether that's true, I couldn't tell you. It's not my letter. He gave her his phone number on a piece of paper torn from a small spiral notebook. He said he'd keep checking on the cabin for as long as she needed, and that the firewood under the tarp in the back was split and ready, and that the well had a hand pump and the water was clean. He said if she ever wanted to come up and didn't want to be alone, he was usually around. He walked to his truck, a green Ford with a dented running board, and he drove off down the logging road, and Lorraine stood on the porch in the cold April air and looked at the creek below, running fast with snowmelt. And she thought about her mother being 22 and frightened and making the decision that frightened, alone women with no good options make. She thought about a little girl with dark braids and her chin tipped up. She thought about a name carved in a lintel. She had $340 in her checking account. She had a sister in Timmins who did not know she existed, and she had 4 acres in the bush above a creek, with a cabin that smelled like her mother and a Hudson's Bay blanket on a cot and a shelf of paperbacks with cracked spines. She was going to come back. She knew that much before she got back in the car. But what happened before she could was what she hadn't anticipated. Stay with us, because this is where the story turns, and the turn is not the one you think it's coming. She had been home 4 days when the email arrived. It was from a law firm in Timmins, and it was addressed to her formally, Lorraine Ann Mackay, formerly Dufresne, and it informed her that the estate of Raymond Carrier had one outstanding asset that had not been settled at the time of his death in 2003. The cabin property on Logging Road 7, off Highway 129, and that 2 of Raymond Carrier's adult children from his marriage had recently become aware of its existence and its current registered ownership and were contesting the original bequest on the grounds. That Greta Dufresne had exercised undue influence over their father in the final years of his life. Lorraine read the email standing at her kitchen and felt the specific coldness of a floor dropping out from underneath her. She called the township clerk, Bev Whittle, who turned out to be a practical woman with very little patience for lawyers who sent intimidating letters to widows and divorcees on land matters that were 20 years settled. That deed has been registered since 2003, Bev said. When your mother transferred it to you in 2016, that was a clean title transfer, properly filed. They've got no case, but they can make it expensive to prove that, which is what they're counting on. Lorraine sat down. How expensive? Bev was quiet for a moment. Enough that it might be easier to let it go, she said, and her voice told Lorraine she knew exactly what that meant for a woman in her situation and hated that it was true. After she hung up, Lorraine sat at her kitchen table for a long time. Outside, the Sudbury April had turned to actual spring. Lilac buds on the neighbor's bush, a kid on a bicycle on the sidewalk, the ordinary world moving along as it always did, without consulting anyone about what was convenient. She thought about writing a check she couldn't write. She thought about a cabin she had been to once. She thought about a sister in Timmins who didn't know there was a contest to be had. And then, she called the number in Timmins that her mother's letter had included, the one she'd been holding for 4 days, trying to decide whether she was ready. Claire Carrier, she had kept her adopted family's name, answered on the 3rd ring, and Lorraine said, "My name is Lorraine Dufresne. Greta was my mother. I think we have some things to talk about." There was a pause, and then Claire said, "I wondered if you'd call," and her voice had an Ojibwe cadence to it that Lorraine hadn't expected, and then felt foolish for not expecting. And the voice was warm, and it was steady, and Lorraine had not heard a voice like that directed at her in longer than she wanted to admit. They talked for 2 hours. Lorraine told her about the cabin and the tin box and the letter. She told her about Raymond's name above the door. She heard Claire's breath catch on the other end of the line. She told her about the lawyers. Claire was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That cabin belonged to my father, the one who left. I never met him. My mother, my adoptive mother, she told me his name when I was 30, and I found out he'd died 2 years before that, And I always thought that was the end of it." She paused. "You're telling me he built a cabin and carved my name above the door?" "Claire, 1972, Lorraine said. Deep, like he meant it to stay. The line was quiet for a moment. "I want to see it," Claire said. They drove up together 3 weeks later. Claire coming from Timmins, Lorraine from Sudbury, meeting at a Tim Hortons in Chapleau, like two women who are simultaneously strangers, and something more specific than strangers, which is what they were. They sat across from each other at a laminate table, and Lorraine thought, "You have Mum's hands," and did not say it yet. Claire was 51 and looked like their mother around the eyes and nothing like her anywhere else. She was quieter than Lorraine had expected, which in retrospect made sense. She'd spent 51 years without a family history, and meeting the woman who had the one she'd been kept from was not a simple thing to walk into a Tim Hortons and do. But she'd shown up. That counted for something. That counted for a lot. They drove up to the cabin in Lorraine's Civic, the road a little drier now, the poplar coming into leaf, and when they pulled into the clearing, Claire got out and stood looking at the cabin for a long moment without speaking. Then she walked to the porch and looked up at the lintel. She stood there for what might have been 2 minutes. Lorraine stayed back by the car and let her. When Claire turned around, her face was composed in the way of someone who has had a great deal of practice holding things in, which made two of them. "Our mother gave this to you," Claire said. "It wasn't an accusation. She gave it to me because she didn't know how to give it to you directly," Lorraine said. "She was afraid. I think she wanted me to be the one, to bridge it. I think that's what the letter was asking. And now some lawyers want to take it, if we let them." Claire looked at the cabin. She looked at the carving above the door. She looked at Lorraine. "Tell me what you need," she said. What they needed turned out to be documented. It turned out that Greta Dufresne had not been a woman who left things to chance, despite every appearance to the contrary. In the bottom of the tin box, beneath the photographs, there was a sealed envelope. Lorraine had not opened because it had written on the outside, in her mother's hand, for the lawyers if it comes to that. Inside was a letter from Raymond Carrier's own solicitor, dated 2001, confirming that Raymond had updated his will of his own volition, and with full capacity, witnessed by 2 independent parties, to include the specific bequest of the cabin property to Greta Dufresne, with a handwritten addendum in Raymond's own hand. "This land is for Claire when Greta sees fit. She'll know when." He had known. He had known about the adoption, and he had known that Greta kept the secret, and he had respected that it was hers to keep, and he had left the one thing he had built with his own hands to the 2 women, who were, between them, the whole of what that chapter of his life had meant. Raymond Carrier's other children had no case. Their own father had said so in writing, clearly enough that even a law firm in Timmins could see the bill wasn't worth chasing. But that was almost beside the point by the time they found out. The point was what happened in the cabin that afternoon, the 2 of them sitting at the small table with the tin box open between them, going through the photographs, one by one, Lorraine explaining who she recognized, and Claire explaining who she didn't know at all, and both of them slowly assembling a woman, their mother, out of 50 years of silence and a box of pictures and a letter that had taken most of a lifetime to write. Claire picked up the photograph of young Greta laughing outside the frame and looked at it for a long time. "I used to imagine what she looked like," Claire said. "The birth mother. When I was little, I thought about it a lot. I made up different versions. What did you decide? Different things at different times. Sad mostly. I thought she must be sad." She set the photograph down. "She doesn't look sad in this. She wasn't sad all the time," Lorraine said, and then wondered if that was true and decided it was, mostly. "She was private. There's a difference." She paused. "She was proud of you, I think, even without knowing you," she said. In the letter she said, "She has your grandfather's eyes." That was the whole line, but she said it like she'd been looking. Claire was quiet. "I don't know how to be angry at a dead woman," she said finally. "I've tried. It seems like the thing I'm supposed to feel, the thing people expect. But she was 22 and alone, and she did the best thing she knew to do, and it gave me a life that... I had a good life, Lorraine. Good parents. I want you to know that. I didn't spend my whole childhood lonely for her." She looked at the carving above the door from where she was sitting. "But I'm glad I know," she said, "and I'm glad he put that up there." Douglas Setter came by that afternoon as he did every week, and when he saw 2 cars in the clearing, he came up the porch steps with an expression of careful hope on his weathered face. Lorraine introduced them. Claire shook his hand and said, "I understand you've been looking after this place for 9 years," and Douglas said, "Your mother asked me to, and she wasn't the kind of woman you said no to." And Claire laughed, a short, surprised laugh, and said, "I'll take your word for it." He stayed for coffee, which Claire made on the small camp stove Lorraine had brought, and he told them about the cabin. Things Greta had told him about Raymond building it. The summers he'd spent up here, the way he'd talked about the north as the only place he felt like himself. He told them the creek flooded every spring and receded by June and left a sandbar downstream. That was the best spot in 3 counties for catching pickerel. He said Raymond used to fish it every summer. He said he hadn't been able to bring himself to fish it since Raymond died, though he'd thought about it. Claire said, "You should come up this summer, bring a rod." Douglas looked at her for a moment. "I believe I will," he said. They drove home in the early evening, back down the logging road, back to the highway, Lorraine heading south and Claire heading east, and they had exchanged numbers and made a loose plan to come back in July, when the weather was warm enough to sleep in the cabin and the creek was down. Before they split off at the highway, Claire rolled down her window and said, across the space between the 2 cars, she kept the name above the door all those years. She never painted over it or let him take it down. Lorraine nodded. "I know," she said. "That means something," Claire said. The lawyers from Timmins received a copy of Raymond Carrier's letter from his solicitor, along with a note from Bev Whittle, at the township office explaining the history of the title transfers. Lorraine did not hear from them again. She got a voicemail from a bored-sounding paralegal, informing her the matter had been resolved in her favor, and she deleted it without saving it. She paid the back property taxes on the cabin with the last of what she had left in savings, and she did not resent it, which surprised her. In July, she and Claire drove up separately and met at the clearing, and spent a weekend there, sleeping in turns on the cot and on a camp mat on the floor. And Douglas came on the Saturday with fishing rods and a bag of groceries, and caught 4 pickerel from the sandbar downstream and cooked them on the wood stove, and all 3 of them ate at the small table while the creek ran loud in the evening and the night came down blue and clear over the streets. Lorraine read some of the paperbacks from the shelf above the cot. They were Raymond's, some of them. His name was written in the front covers in a small, neat hand. She showed Claire. Claire held the books and looked at his handwriting for a while. Then she put them back on the shelf. "Leave them," she said. "They're part of the place." Later, sitting on the porch in the dark, listening to Douglas and Claire talking at the table inside, she had discovered that both of them had strong opinions about Canadian hockey, which was bonding them in real time. Lorraine thought about her mother sitting in this same chair, maybe in this same dark, holding the same silence she'd carried her whole life. The same creek, the same spruce smell, the same name above the door every time she'd walked in. She thought about what it cost to carry something that long. And then she thought about what it cost to set it down, which was not nothing, and was also not what she'd thought it was going to be. She had driven up here to deal with a tax bill. She had found a sister and an unlived story, and a corner of her mother she had not known was there to look for. The cabin was hers, and Claire's in the way that things can be yours without a deed to prove it. And Douglas came in the summer, and the pickerel were good, and the spruce smell came through the window, sharp and clean in the mornings. And Lorraine was 54 years old with $340 to her name, and a rented apartment and a divorce she was still getting used to. But she drove up to the cabin on long weekends, and she slept on the cot under the Hudson's Bay blanket, and in the mornings she made coffee on the camp stove and sat on the porch above the creek and listened to the particular silence of the northern Ontario bush, which is not empty silence, but the kind that is full of small sounds if you pay attention. And she was learning to pay attention. She found a notacard tucked into one of Raymond's paperbacks, in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Older than his, a woman's hand, perhaps his mother's, that said only, "Raymond, don't forget to write." She left it in the book. Some things were not hers to throw away. She kept the name above the door. She kept everything. That first October, after the leaves had gone and before the first snow, she went up alone and spent a night, and in the morning she sat at the small table and took out a notacard of her own. She'd brought a box of them from home, for some reason she hadn't examined, and she wrote 2 things. The first was Claire's name and phone number, which she tucked into the same paperback where she'd found Raymond's note card, because it seemed right to leave a trail for whoever came after. The second she pinned to the inside of the door with a thumbtack she found in the bottom of a drawer. It said in her own handwriting, plain as her mother's 3 lines, Greta Dufresne was here. She carried something heavy for a very long time. Leave the name above the door. She drove home in the dark, 4 hours south, and the highway ran out of the bush and into the lit-up ordinary world of the city. And the silence in the car was different from any silence she had driven through before. It was not the silence of something missing. It was the silence of something kept and passed on, and in the keeping and the passing made into something that had not quite existed before. She had been wrong about her mother, not about all of it. Greta had been private past the point of kindness, and the secret had cost all 3 of them something real. But underneath the privacy, underneath the silence, underneath the 50 years of folded tight and never mentioned, there had been a woman who drove 4 hours north to look at a name carved in a lintel, and could not bring herself to let it go. And she had left the door open in the end. In her own too late, too quiet way, she had left it open. Lorraine intended to keep it that way.